Hey folks, so as you may have figured out by now, I'm a bit of a political nerd, which means every 4 years when the presidential election comes around, I geek out getting ready to watch the presidential debates. That said, as someone who coaches debate, one of the things that always drives me crazy about presidential debates is how the candidates never seem to actually respond to each other's arguments and instead just want to deliver a pre-chunked out version of their campaign speech. Well, fortunately in this class, we have different expectations of how a debate is supposed to take place, which brings us to our video today, the language of refutation. Over the next few slides, I'm going to go over the process of talking about the language of refutation, as well as giving you some specifics, techniques that you can use in debate rounds when responding to both advantages and disadvantages. So let's go ahead and get started. Starting with an overview, I want to talk a little bit about the importance of refuting arguments. I think in a debate round, there are a variety of reasons why it's important to actually engage with the arguments of your opponent. First off, it's the thing that creates clash in debate. The concept of clash is the idea that when one argument is presented, we see that response, and that back and forth over the constructive speeches into the rebuttal is what really produces the content of the debate, and frankly, it's what makes debates interesting and entertaining. A second reason that it's important to have refutation in a debate is that it improves the education. When we're responding to each other's arguments, it allows us to gain more in-depth understanding about the issue that we're discussing, and it can even illuminate ideas that we hadn't previously thought of when we went into the debate round. Third, it allows us to be able to test ideas. The core of a policy-style debate is to have a discussion about whether or not we ought to do something. And to be able to fully understand the ins and outs of that issue, it's important for us to be able to spend some time really picking it apart. Refuting arguments, particularly at the advantage and disadvantage level, is the practical way where we're able to do this. Finally, refutation is the key to winning debates. In debate, since the rule is any argument that goes unresponded to is conceded, refutation is the way that you make sure that your opponent has to do a lot of work to win their offensive arguments and to make sure in responding to arguments that you're not dropping those arguments and conceding points that you need to win them. So with that basics coming down, let's talk a little bit about some of the ways that you can refute advantages and disadvantages. So let's start by taking a look at some of the basic ways that you can refute either advantages or disadvantages. Know on the outset that there are a few different techniques that work here, and depending on whether it's an advantage or disadvantage, will change slightly how you might use these arguments. Nonetheless, they still all work. Now, there are four basic defensive ways to respond to advantages and disadvantages: the non-unique argument, the no-link argument, the no-internal link argument, and the no-impact argument. Let's spend a couple minutes going over each of these individually. So first, the non-unique argument. As you may have guessed, the non-unique argument is an argument that is used in response to the uniqueness of either an advantage or a disadvantage. Since the uniqueness makes a claim about the direction of the status quo, there are a couple ways that you can use this argument. First, you can use a non-unique argument simply to dispute whether or not the uniqueness situation of the advantage or disadvantage is actually factually correct. If the affirmative has made an error or misrepresented the status quo, you can simply say, non-unique, that's not true, and here's why. More complex and perhaps nuanced way to do this is to dispute the direction of the status quo. Oftentimes, in order to win an advantage, the affirmative team has to convince us that the uniqueness is bad and heading in a worse direction. And likewise, on the negative, a leader of opposition would have to convince us that the uniqueness of a disadvantage is something that is good or stable and will generally head in that direction in the future. You can use a non-unique argument to dispute that claim about the direction of the uniqueness and instead claim that if things are left as they are, that the uniqueness would head in the opposite direction. For an advantage, that might convince us that the status quo is solving, and for a disadvantage, that might convince us that the status quo is actually starting to head in a worse direction, even if it had been good previously, meaning the plan would really have no effect on the status quo. So now that we've talked a little bit about how to respond to uniqueness arguments, let's talk a little bit about the links. The second defensive argument that we're going to learn today is that of the no-link argument. Now, I warn you, depending on how the affirmative team has put together the link argument of their advantage, you may not be able to use a no-link argument in response to the advantage, particularly if they are simply using their power of fiat to say the plan happens. And this isn't a bad strategy when constructing advantages because it really makes the links non-debatable. However, if they make a claim about how their plan leads to change in the status quo at the link level, then you can use a no-link argument to dispute that. So when using the no-link argument on the negative, you can use this to argue that the plan won't solve for the advantage. This can often happen when the affirmative team has made some sort of a strategic error in putting forth their argument, and perhaps maybe fiated the wrong agent of change or the wrong action, or simply did something that wasn't significant enough to lead to actual change. When running this on the affirmative against a disadvantage, you can argue that ultimately that there is no link, that the plan doesn't trigger the internal links to the disadvantage, right? Which would basically mean that when run, you would not per se see the internal link scenario start to execute, and thus there wouldn't be the bad thing that would happen as a result from this, right? So basically, no link to the internal links which lead to the impact. All right. Now that we understand a little bit about how the no link argument works, we'll move on to the third defensive argument, the no internal link. Now, the no internal link argument is structurally very similar to that of a no-link argument. However, it follows the internal link causal chain of arguments that happens as we move from the link to the impacts of either an advantage or a disadvantage. So you remember, when dealing with a linear advantage, the affirmative team tends to argue that if they enact their plan, the status quo will get better and ultimately lead to good things. However, if the affirmative is running a non-linear advantage, their first internal link is typically, in the absence of plan, these bad things start to happen, and then they explain how the things in the status quo get worse and ultimately lead them to their impact. You can use a no internal link argument at any of the internal links to basically claim that the thing that they are arguing happens next indeed does not happen next. Now, while one internal link is always enough to disrupt an advantage or disadvantage, know that it is sometimes a good strategy to run multiple no internal link arguments as you work your way through answering either an advantage or a disadvantage. Because if you can disrupt a single internal link, it ultimately takes away that offensive argument from your opponent. Finally, the last defensive argument that I would like to talk about is the no impact argument. Now, depending on how many impact scenarios your opponent presents, you may need to make multiple of these to really dispute the impact scenario. However, it's not uncommon for an affirmative or negative team, when constructing advantages or disadvantages, to only have a single yet comprehensive impact scenario. The basic of the no impact argument is that you're saying that the impact that they are claiming that happens either as a result of passing plan or through the disadvantage indeed doesn't happen. Now, this might simply be an extension of a no link or no internal link argument, where it might be an independent reason why the impact may not happen. So it's not uncommon when we start having debates about international issues and talking about the possibility of war, for a debater to link to the concept of nuclear war, because it gives them an extinction level impact scenario, which has a really big magnitude. However, there are some probability issues with the nuclear war scenario, specifically that there are multiple things in effect that could prevent that from happening, such as intervening actors, meaning that people don't ever actually press the button, or the fact that since we have mutually assured destruction and countries know that no one would ever actually launch nukes because they know it's a zero-sum game and that everybody loses, hence no reason to play. So these types of arguments can be useful at neutralizing the impact level of an advantage or disadvantage, because if you have no impact, then you have no net benefit of the advantage or net detriment of the disadvantage, which basically takes them out right at the end. All right, now that we understand some of the ways to be defensive, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the ways that you can go about being offensive when responding to advantages and disadvantages. So While making defensive arguments tends to make a lot of sense in debate because they tend to be the easiest arguments to make, if you're wanting to get a little bit more complex, you can also try to make a couple types of offensive arguments. Now, the difference between a defensive and an offensive argument is where a defense simply tries to neutralize an advantage or disadvantage. Offensive arguments actually attempt to turn that argument around so it becomes a benefit for the team that is arguing it, which means when a negative team runs an offensive argument, they're typically trying to turn an advantage into a disadvantage, and when an affirmative team runs an offensive response, they're oftentimes attempting to turn a disadvantage into an additional advantage or net benefit for them. Now, there are two different ways that you can run offensive arguments. Let's go ahead and talk first about link or internal link turns, and then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about impact turns. Link and internal link turns. So the idea behind a link or an internal link turn is basically to claim that the plan actually causes the opposite of what it is claimed. So on an advantage, what this often means is where the affirmative claims that passing the plan leads to an end of bad things and the creation of good things. A link turn or an internal link turn claims that the plan will actually cause the opposite thing to take place. And so if we are having a debate about the economy and the affirmative team claims that the economy is currently not doing so great, but that plan is going to make it better, the negative team might go down to that link level where the affirmative claims that the plan makes the status quo better, makes the economy better, and presents an argument why doing the plan might actually adversely make the economy get worse. This is useful for the negative team because what this does is it simultaneously takes away the affirmative's advantage, where their net benefits comes from, and creates a net detriment, a reason that they make the status quo worse. And that's pretty handy. On the flip side, the affirmative can also use link turns in responding to a disadvantage. Oftentimes, when running a disadvantage, the negative team presents a scenario that is good or stable in the status quo and argue that the plan actually makes that thing worse. By turning the link or the internal link of that disadvantage, if the affirmative wins that argument, they can convince us that in opposition to what the negative claimed, that passing their plan might make that scenario better. So if the affirmative team says that affordable housing has been increasing in the status quo, but passing plan is going to take away that housing and is going to lead people to become homeless, and the affirmative team has an argument as to why passing their plan will actually increase the availability of affordable housing, they are now able to gain an additional net benefit to their plan, which can be pretty useful to them. Do be careful when running these types of arguments, because, as I'll explain in a second, if you run both a link and a impact turn in the same round, you can actually double turn it around yourself and cause the bad things that you're claiming. But we'll talk more about that on the next slide. So the last piece of the language of refutation that I want to cover today is the concept of impact turns. Now, it's rare that these arguments are actually used in a debate, but occasionally the opportunity does arise. The basic of an impact turn is to make a claim that the impact of an advantage is actually a good thing that you want to happen, or the same thing on a disadvantage. Because oftentimes what we're talking about on the advantage are avoiding bad things that are headed in our direction on the status quo, or on disadvantages, having the plan trigger those bad things. So we can flip the direction on that and gain its a benefit. I will warn folks that you should really kind of think about the logic that you're using on these impact turns, because it becomes a problem if you find yourself advocating for horrible things, right? If the negative team runs a disadvantage and the impact of the disadvantage is it's going to lead to the deaths of billions of people, probably not in the best interest of the moral high ground to be like, oh, impact turn, humans are really bad and it'd be great if we could cause the mass extinction of most of them. That said, I have definitely watched that debate, so use this information wisely. All right, so that ultimately sums up the different techniques and methods that you can use to run the language of refutation. Now let's go ahead and see if you can use this effectively in round. I'm going to briefly present an advantage scenario to you right now, and what you can do is go ahead and flow this down and attempt to try to come up with a couple of responses to this advantage using the terminology discussed in this lecture. All right, let's briefly walk through this advantage before we wrap up this lecture. So imagine in a hypothetical debate that the affirmative team is enacting a plan that is going to increase taxes, and they have a single advantage on how ultimately this is going to kind of improve the economy. Let me walk you through that advantage step by step. All right, so advantage one, you go ahead and call this the economy. Our first argument is the uniqueness. Currently, when we look at multiple indicators right now, we can see that the U.S. economy is crashing in the status quo. It's doing really, really bad, as we all know. Which brings me into the second argument of my advantage, which is that of the link. If we pass our plan will increase taxes on the wealthy. Let's go ahead now and go down to our internal link arguments, which we have two of. Our first argument here is that if we increase taxes on the wealthy through our plan, that increased tax revenue will ultimately be spent to fund social support programs like welfare, which leads us to our second internal link argument that access to welfare is key to letting folks escape poverty, right? When they have welfare, they can use that to ultimately get themselves out of poverty, which is really important because that leads us to our final argument of this advantage, which is that of the impact. And we would say that poverty is pretty much the worst impact scenario that you could have ever, and it's ultimately the biggest impact of this debate. We say that poverty is the root cause to all violence. It leads to massive suffering. It leads to death. And ultimately, once you find yourself in poverty, it's really hard to reverse. Hence the reason that we need this plan to be able to avoid this impact. All right, folks, having listened to that advantage now, we have intentionally left some flaws of logic there for you to be able to try to use that language of refutation. Give it a shot and see what you can come up with, and hopefully these techniques will be useful to you when you engage in your next debate. Thanks for watching, and hope you all have a fantastic day. This video is licensed under a Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike license, which means that you're feel free to go ahead and share this video as much as you like in any medium or format. But also, if you look to the description of the YouTube video, I've included a link to the PowerPoint. Feel free to steal this and remix it and make it your own. The only thing that I ask is you give credit to me when you publish those materials out on the web, and that you do so under a similar Creative Commons license. Thanks for watching.